Hey guys, in this week's book, we looked at Dark Bargain, Slavery, Profits, and the Struggle for the Constitution by Lawrence Goldstone. And the quote that we're looking at this week is talking about how sectionalism and slavery were the two key aspects of what happened um, during the debates and compromises that took place during the Convention of 1787. And so I think starting out at the beginning of the book, you see him talking about the sectionalism as issue, even becoming a very prominent issue in during the American Revolution years. In 1775, for instance, Benjamin Franklin proposed a national government and sent it into the Continental Congress, as well as Silas Deane, and both were actually inevitably shot down by them. And you could see that that also led to even the Articles of Confederation being shot down, in a sense that it was actually a weaker draft by the end of November 1777 from where it had been a year earlier in 1776 of June or so. And one comment that he had mentioned was the debates over the formation of the Confederation were essentially involved with the state interest. Only the debates over representation touch on the nature of union and the problem of sovereignty, and even here the polemics were tied closely to individual state interests. And again, you see that this nationalist versus loyalist concept coming up, that there were still a lot of people that were they felt that they were going to go back to that monarchical system, and by submitting these drafts, you see that split, that those nationalists and those democratic concepts were coming in and were rocking that sectionalism issue, beginning with nationalist, loyalists, and seeing that the founding fathers were very much nationalistic, and although some of them were very, they were still relying on the English system a little bit in regard to how they framed their legislative decisions and judicial systems regarding the Constitution later on. You see that they wanted this equal representation, quote unquote, regarding the popular vote and trying to get everyone's representation voiced, even though it wasn't there ultimately. And you see that in the Articles of Confederation, that these debates were over that representation, that whether or not, which is too much representation, which states deserve more based on population. And I think that's a concept that's based on those political philosophers that that the nationalists were basing their opinions off of, rather than the traditional loyalists were relying on for this one power, one vote concept. And I think that leads to later on, you see these issues popping up over sectionalism in a different way regarding slavery, and that gets into the 1780s with, you have Shays Rebellion, and you have other slave revolts going on at the time of the convention. And I think that those revolts were pointing to the issue of what states have that representation, what states over property, over economic availability. And that transpired in one delegate talking about how he knew the reason why the South had received many seats, and this is on page 113, that he could see that slavery was seen as property, as a property side, that slaves were not free agents. They have no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary, are themselves property, and like other property, entirely at the will of the master. Has a man of Virginia a number of votes in proportion to the number of his slaves? And I think he also talked about how it's compared to if Georgia and South Carolina had the same seats as Virginia, for instance, then there wouldn't have been such an issue regarding property in that sense. But then that leads to the issue of who gets to be represented, that slaves should have been freed in the beginning of this issue. Then there wouldn't have been that encouragement of representation in that slave life. And I think that's what Goldstone was getting at, that these differences, these debates that were taking place during the Convention of 1787 were brought out from the issues at hand regarding slavery and sectionalism. And I think he did a good job in this book of discussing the founding fathers in a different light, that they were very much resistant to keeping everyone's voices heard, that they were not initially making the Constitution a very democratic one. It was very much a more, I guess, self-intent one. They were, even on the end of the page, he talked about how it is distinctly possible that had idealism dominated in Philadelphia, American democracy would have failed. And I think that is interesting, that there was a lot about a lot of these founding men and delegates were very much self-interested. They had their own state rights. They had their state's interest over a nationalistic embodiment. And I think that's where they failed. And that's where he, I think, was pointing out that aspect, that the delegates failed in a way that, yeah, they didn't create a unified system, but again, they created a American republic, and that was very different from what so many believed that they could not do, that this nation was going to fail ultimately and go back to being a colonial entity. And I think, yes, even though we succeeded in creating a different world, but at the end of the day, what was the cost of that? A lot of the slaves had to pay for that, and it took so many years after the fact for them to gain those rights, and even other rights for other people. And I think that's where Goldstone points out in this book, and I think, and is very telling to me, that the founding fathers are, I'm seeing them in a very different direction concerning I think the approach that they should have taken differently regarding other issues, rather than focusing on the sectionalism and slavery and more nationalistic issues going on. And I think loyalty just wasn't there so much. And I enjoyed reading this book, and I look forward to seeing everyone else's comments as well.